When the Sony a7IV first came out, there were a lot of people talking about how it overheated and how there was a 4K 60 crop and the rolling shutter isn't great. So we're going to talk about all the things that the Sony a7IV doesn't do very well, or at least I personally don't really like that it does. After using it for like a year and a half and also having used an FX series camera, the FX30, there's some things that one definitely does better than this. I will also preface all of this with I like the camera, I've used it a lot and I will continue using it, but I just have some gripes. Let's start with the big ones. Rolling shutter. Now, this is notorious for having pretty bad rolling shutter. It's very slow. I'm pretty sure it's like 30 milliseconds or something like that. Maybe it's 20 something. But when you're doing pans, it's very noticeable, especially on the screen. I think it's a little bit less noticeable on the actual recording itself when you're watching it later, but it's very jello-y sort of thing in camera. And in general, it's going to be worse than even something like the FX30. The FX30 has a bit better rolling shutter performance. It'll be horrible compared to something like the A7S III, FX3, FX6, and then even more a global shutter camera. So rolling shutter on this is not great, but in most scenarios, unless you're shooting very fast-paced stuff or doing a lot of panning where it matters that things are very straight and motion looks right, it's not really a big deal unless that is your use case. So it's probably not going to be an issue for most people. It hasn't really been an issue for me. I just do notice it sometimes if I am moving the camera around side to side. The next big one is overheating. Now, people have done overheating tests and all that. I haven't actually done any tests or anything. I just know that this camera does get hot. Even when I first got it out of the box and I was just going through the settings, it was getting very warm. It gets warm even when it's just not doing much, especially when you're in the settings. I notice it gets very warm. So even without recording, it gets warm. When you are recording, it gets warm. But as long as you have the setting, like the auto off, the warning, the heat warning, that sort of stuff, as long as you have that set to high, it's probably not gonna overheat on you unless you're shooting in very hot conditions and you're not giving it the best chance. So if you leave the screen closed, you're probably gonna have more issues than if you leave it open because a lot of heat can escape on that back panel there. So leaving the screen open, letting the camera move around potentially versus sitting it on a tripod, keeping it out of the sun, all those sort of things can sort of prevent overheating, but that doesn't really stop it from getting hot. Like, it does get hot to the touch. Not so hot that you don't want to touch it, but it gets very warm. I've never had it actually overheat, but I don't trust this as much as something like my FX30 that has a built-in fan, so I know that that's not going to overheat. Whereas this one, you know, if it has some unfavorable conditions, there's a chance it could overheat. And that is not something that you want in like an interview or if you're just doing a really long shoot, especially if you have it externally powered as well. If you're going for longer than a normal battery would last, then you know, maybe you'd have some issues. And then the other really big critique that a lot of people had when this was first announced is the crop in 4K 50 or 4K 60. It can do 4K 10-bit 422 at 50 or 60 frames per second in APS-C mode. So it does crop in to an APS-C size frame on the sensor. So that means that if you are switching between 25 and 50 or 24 and 60 or 30 and 60, that you're going to be having that cropping in and out depending on your frame rate. If you're shooting in 1080p, not a big deal because there is no cropping. You can do anything up to 50 in, I think it can even do actually 100 frames a second or 120 frames a second full frame in 1080p. And I'm not saying that APS-C or Super 35 is bad or anything. I have the FX30, it's pretty good. But what is annoying is, you know, using a 40mm lens, for example, and then if you switch to S&Q mode or you just go to a higher frame rate, it's now going to be a 60mm equivalent. So you have to deal with the change of focal length, especially if you are switching back and forth. Or if you're using two cameras, if this is shooting in slow motion or just a high frame rate, you're going to need to deal with having that crop. So you're probably going to need to shoot on a wider lens. And I have found this annoying when I'm shooting like slow motion B-roll for anything for these videos. Even when if I want to get B-roll and I was using like my 85mm lens, I have to get back so far to get a good framing. Whereas if I could shoot it in full frame, I wouldn't need to get back as far and it would look probably better. So again, it's not a huge deal, but it is a deal, and it's a little bit annoying. Okay, the next one, I don't know if other people really have talked about it all that much, but this camera does not support loading your own LUTs into it. On the FX cameras and even some of the newer cameras, like even the ZV-E1, which is cheaper than this, you can load your own LUTs onto and then turn that on as like a display LUT to monitor it on the LCD screen or even on an external monitor. Whereas this, you can't load your own LUTs into. So I have to rely on having a LUT in the monitor. And if I'm not using a monitor, then all I can do to view a non-S-Log3 image is to have Gamma Assist on there. But Gamma Assist is not the same as a LUT because it doesn't give you a look and it doesn't affect exposure. Whereas if I'm gonna put a monitoring LUT on one of my Sony cameras, because S-Log3 likes to be overexposed, it's going to have that built-in exposure reduction in the LUT. So using Gamma Display Assist will change the colors so they look a bit better, but it's not gonna be able to add any look that you want to it if you want it to have a particular look. Like if you wanna make the shadows a little bit bluer like they are right now, you can't do that, and you can't adjust for exposure. So something that they could probably pretty easily update with firmware is to add LUT support to cameras like these. I don't see why, you know, a hybrid mirrorless camera can't support LUTs when, you know, a cinema camera that's cheaper than it can. Now, that being said, most of the time that I would need a monitoring LUT, I'd have an external monitor anyway, so I can just load the LUT in the monitor, but I prefer having it on in camera, on my FX30 at least, because it looks better on the monitor and it's just easier because it's just one button on the back of the body versus maybe going in a couple of clicks on the monitor. So again, not a big deal, just a little annoying. And then here's one that's even less of a big deal, but also quite annoying. The HDMI door. Now it's got all the IO doors on the side here. You know, you've got your flip out ones. They are sort of like a hybrid, like hard, soft plastic rubber thing. So they're not solid like they are on the FX30 or the FX3. Those are just like solid plastic, they flip up. But that's not my gripe with them. My gripe is the HDMI door and how it flips down long ways like this. So it actually gets in the way of a lot of things. If I was to take a NATO handle, like this one here, slide it on the NATO rail, that gets right in the way of that and it just closed the door. So you can use NATO accessories on the side here with the door open, but it does kind of get in the way when sliding onto the NATO rail on this cage. And yes, I know you can take these doors off. I don't want to do that though, because they would still prevent stuff getting in the ports when you don't have anything plugged into them. But it's just that little bit annoying that, you know, the FX cameras are fine because they have solid doors and they open forwards, not down, so they take up much less space. Now, this is not something that they can sort of fix in firmware because it is very hardware, but it is a little bit annoying when you're trying to put handles or other NATO accessories on the side of your a7IV or similar camera. And this is kind of like a little bit of a gripe that I have with just the form factor of these types of like hybrid mirrorless cameras, the FX30 included, is just the fact that everything's coming out the side. All of the cables are coming out the side, which is right where you'd want to put a handle, so it gets in the way of any left handle that you're going to put on there. And it also blocks the flip out screen when you have a bunch of stuff plugged in. If I have cables coming out here, they're all blocking things. So, you know, if I have an HDMI cable, a USB cable, and an audio cable, that's so much of the screen on one side that's being blocked out. And right now, looking at the FX30, I can't see the audio levels, and it's even worse on this because where the audio levels sit on the display. So that's when a box style camera would be better because they often have their IO on the back. So it's gonna get in the way of less things. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Other than that, it's a very solid camera. Like I said, I like the camera. I just have a few issues with it. Let me know if there's any that I missed that are like little annoying things or things that people sort of really complained about at the start, but like aren't that big of a deal. But hopefully in, you know, future iterations of this camera, maybe when the a7IV comes out, like in a year or two, that it would perform a lot better than this in a lot of ways. I don't know how they're gonna do that, but I'm probably not gonna get an a7IV. I'd rather get an FX6 Mark II or an FX3 Mark II. That's all for this one. Let me know what you think. Do all the other things. I'll see you next time. Okay, bye.